welcome to the New Lines Magazine podcast. My name is Kareem Shaheen, and I'm your host for today, sitting in for Faisal Yafi and his dulce British tones. I had British teachers when I was in school, but I wonder how different my life would have been if I had picked up the accent. But I digress. Today we've got a very special guest with us. His name is Asser Khattab, and he's a Syrian journalist who's covered Syria for several years now. Asser, how are you? Where does this podcast find you?
Hi, Kareem. I'm now in Paris, where I live, where I've been living for the past 2 years, and I'm very happy to be with you today.
I'm really happy to have you here too. So Asser, I'm going to jump right in. You wrote for us an incredible piece called "Why I Stopped Writing About Syria," and I wanted to start by asking you to tell our listeners a little bit about your career as a journalist, how you got started, and especially how you got started as a journalist in Syria. It's when you got started, there wasn't a whole lot of space for journalists to flourish, to write about what they want to write about. So what got you into the profession in the first place?
True. I mean, it was a weird decision from the beginning, in the eyes of my family, for example, or everyone around me, when I said that I want to become a journalist and I wanted to go to university and study journalism. First of all, because of what society normally requires of people. So to study medicine or pharmacy or engineering, in Syria, people kind of look down on, journalism, literature, other kinds of fields of study. And the other point, which was a more valid point, of course, than the first one, was that Syria is not the best country for journalists to flourish and to work. And I did not want to become someone who works for, regime-owned media, even before the war, so to speak, and even before the war. And I wanted to do it anyway. And I thought, I'd figure it out later and to see where it could take me, whether inside the country or outside of it. And I, of course, wanted to become a journalist since before the revolution, 2011. I did go to Damascus and study journalism at school. Didn't learn much because of, you can imagine studying journalism in Assad's Syria. But it really started when I got around because of, luckily, speaking foreign languages and being, as I say in the piece, foolish enough to risk my life and go around working with teams of foreign journalists visiting the country from Britain, from the United States, France, Germany, to function basically as the interpreter in theory, but also in practice do a little bit more. So even though I had just started doing journalism, I was relying on personal connections to find sources and my knowledge of the country to kind of know where to go and where we can find interesting stories or people to talk to. And that helped me in the beginning to watch professional journalists do their jobs and learn from that, but also to start a network of journalists that I could later, use in order to get jobs when I left Syria. And even before leaving Syria, I managed to get a job with an international news agency, although it was in secret because I technically did not have the right to have this kind of job when I lived in regime-held areas. And here we're talking, of course, the war had already started. So I would go and report from different cities and then travel every month or so to Lebanon, from where I could do phone calls to opposition-held areas and where I also could collect my salary. That continued, of course, until I started to face some problems because of my work and then had to leave the country, where I found myself in Lebanon as an illegal, undocumented Syrian immigrant, much as hundreds of thousands of Syrians. And it was when I also managed to work from regional bureaus of some international news outlets for 3 years before moving on to Paris to claim asylum.
So tell me a little bit about how it works exactly, because your case is, obviously the Syria war is an extraordinary circumstance, but the mechanism of a local reporter working with international media outlets is one that's quite typical of the region, where a lot of local journalists end up working as fixers or as news assistants, working with international correspondents. Could you talk to me a little bit about how that works exactly?
Of course. So for many of those international media outlets, as you know, they most of the correspondents that they have around the world are sent maybe from headquarters or hired from a certain country to go to cover another, for example. And sometimes we get an international correspondent who's the Beirut correspondent for an American newspaper, and he does or she does the job for 2 years and then moves on to become a correspondent in China or in France or in India or in Kenya. And that always means that they cannot have a full mastery of the language of the country or the region where they're working, or also understand the culture, immerse themselves really well in it, and have a certain network of sources on all sides if there's a conflict, for example, that could allow them to work. So what they do, and especially in big media outlets, is to hire someone who's a local journalist, kind of like I was in Syria and in Lebanon, who speaks the language, whose native language is the language of the region, but also speaks the language of the media outlet, in my case, English for the most part, and can write and speak in both. So this person can be relied on for the collection of information, the sourcing of contacts, speaking to them, doing interviews, and transcribing those interviews and taking the important bits from them. Also keeping the other colleagues who don't speak the language or don't really know the region as much as that person does up to date with the news every day. What's happening? What's significant? What should we be following? So I was this person, and many people have this kind of job. As you said, they're often called news assistants when you have a job at this company, or a fixer when you're doing working on a specific project, for example, for a specific period of time. It was quite rewarding in the beginning. I remember being this undocumented immigrant in Lebanon, and quite unsure of what's going to come next, quite scared of the future. Getting a job at an international newspaper at the time was one of the happiest moments of my life. I was very, very glad. I actually said at the time that I would be happy to do this job even for free, without getting any salary, and not much recognition either, because it was a very big name. And I thought that have I just made it? Because I went to journalism school hoping that one day, maybe in a decade or so, I can get a job at one of those media outlets. And here I am, a year after my graduation or so, already starting to do this. Unfortunately, this didn't last very long. And then you realize that you haven't, and I say that in the article, I actually haven't made it. It was very important, and I learned a lot in many ways. And I worked with amazing colleagues and at amazing newspapers and media outlets, but never really regarded as a member of the family, so to speak, of this media outlet, but as someone who's there to help, and they appreciate this kind of help, but also not to expect to be moved around, for example, like they do with other correspondents, or to be used in covering different themes or different countries or regions. So you feel like you can only work on your country, but also you're too biased to rise up to do your country as the main correspondent, for example. And this was quite a dilemma for me, as well as for many of my friends and colleagues.
Yeah, could you talk a little bit about the difficulties that I mean, what does being a member of the team actually entail? What were you looking for out of the job that you weren't provided with? You mentioned obviously the ability to report on other on other stories and other themes, and we'll get to that in a second. But how did they see you? Did they see you as an employee? Did they see you as sort of a freelancer? What exactly was the situation there?
In technical terms, I was an independent contractor. So I would get a salary every month from this company. I had the right to work with other companies, but I would need to ask for permission, and it would need to be a very small project because I technically have a full-time job. But I also was not a staff employee. So, and that's mostly what we mean when we talk of a member of the family of the company, because in one of my jobs, for example, even though I had amazing colleagues, everyone I worked with there was absolutely fantastic, and I learned so much from them. I wasn't even given an email address from the company, and I was not included in very important discussions on the team's Slack, for example, or general meetings with the regional editors, the general editors of the newspaper. So I was only regarded as this person who provides supplementary help on this specific subject, even though I wasn't even included in discussions, editorial discussions on that one country, for example, Syria or Lebanon, and not a phone number from the company, for example, which is, not so much for prestige, the email address and the phone number, as much as it was for security reasons. Using my personal email address was not very wise to do, but I had no other option. A financial reason. I wanted to be compensated, of course, for the work calls that I did, which, as a matter of fact, in one of my jobs, I wasn't. And when I had discussions with my superiors about my future at the company, I would always get very vague answers, or even hear that, I should not be expecting anything beyond what I already have. Because I remember once being asked, actually, when I applied for something else at a company that I had been working for, someone asked me, why do you want to be a journalist? Now, I know that I'm, very young. Maybe I don't have that much experience compared to other journalists who've been doing this for years and years and years. But I do think that I'm a journalist. I'd been doing this at that point for a few years, and being asked that question was somewhat off-putting.
And I wanted to ask you how you feel that actually impacts the coverage of these media organizations in the region, because your case is not the only one. There are. I mean, when I was starting out, I was offered a job as a fixer for a big international publication in Beirut after applying for a job as a reporter. And I didn't understand why I needed to translate and fix and arrange interviews when I was already proven myself as a reporter, albeit for a local newspaper. But how does it impact the work that they produce? I have a lot of respect for the foreign correspondents that cover the region. I think they're among the most talented and compassionate people in the industry. And I think they get to cover stories that we can't. Case in point, you could not write about Syria from inside Syria, right? When I was based in Turkey, I couldn't. I was able to cover cases like journalists going to jail because of stories that they'd written, while those local journalists were being tried and were going to jail. So what do you see as the benefit that foreign correspondents bring to regional coverage, and how is it affected by the fact that they're placing a reporter, very talented reporter like you, as a news assistant, as sort of a subsidiary to their correspondent, and not taking into account all your expertise and knowledge of the region and knowledge of the local language.
That's a very important question. And I think in some way, it is very good on their part to realize that there's a certain need for someone like me, or any of those wonderful, wonderful news assistants working in Lebanon, in Egypt, in many countries around the world. Um, if it's to be compared with having someone who, for example, doesn't speak the language yet and doesn't have as much immersion in the culture yet, without a news assistant. So definitely dedicating a budget and a place for someone like me to support this coverage is very good. All the colleagues that I've worked with, without an exception, in those companies, were always reliant on me to confirm that what they're saying is accurate. I had even senior editors call me every now and then, and sometimes skipping several people that are between me and them in the hierarchy, to confirm from my own experience and knowledge that what they're saying is true, it's accurate, and it's not problematic in any way. And I do appreciate that. What the problem that I had is that as I said, I did not have room to grow within these companies, or to change what I was doing. So it's very important already that they have these people and hire locals in that sense. They do bring to the table something that we can't, and it's a very good point that you made there, because in a country, for example, like Lebanon, or even Syria, in some cases and at certain points in time, it was much, safer and better for something to be said by a foreign correspondent than by a local one. In Lebanon, I was not technically a local. I'm not Lebanese, but I was Syrian, and Syrians had their own status in Lebanon that is very, very inferior. And I was at very high risk of saying certain things that my colleagues were able to say. Now, that's very unfair, and it's obviously not my colleague's fault. But it's good that we had this colleague actually who's able to say these things and who's able to push certain limits that I can't, so that our coverage was not affected at all. So I do like the coverage of the companies that where I worked, and I do like that they respected the role that I played in those stories that we worked on. Sometimes the lack of a local's guidance or information can be seen in some articles, I think, or from the coverage of certain companies of Iraq or Syria or Lebanon. And you can see that someone who's local or someone who's lived long enough in the area to understand it was not consulted. And we had cases of journalists living in the region for decades, not learning the language and getting some very serious things misunderstood or mixed up in their articles that were read by thousands of people and maybe influenced some others.
I think you wrote about one of those, Robert Fisk,
Yes, yeah.
in a seminal article for Receive 22, an independent Arab media outlet. Tell
And that was,
me,
a case that I witnessed firsthand. He was one of the most famous journalists, possibly the most famous journalist to cover the Middle East for foreign media. And I got to see how decades later, the lack of the knowledge of the Arabic language, which I realize many people don't know that he didn't speak any Arabic, really affected what he was doing.
can you talk briefly about the scene that you witnessed and that you wrote about?
Well, it was actually the last thing I did before leaving Syria, and one of the things that led to me having to leave. I was with an international TV company in Homs, in the center of Syria, and we were embedded kind of on the same trip with some other journalists, including Robert Fisk. We basically visited the same places and reported on the same things. I remember there were evacuations happening from areas formerly held by the opposition, and I Fisk was standing next to me, not that far away, interviewing the governor of Homs, and he had with him. I thought she was a minder, a government minder that was imposed on him because of her clear relations to the Syrian Mukhabarat, which I would know later, and her very pro-regime attitude and her very, very bad English. But I later learned that he actually hired her for some reason and chooses her every time and pays her money. And he was trying to interview the governor of Homs, who, as a matter of fact, didn't speak almost any English himself. But the governor at some point looked very angry and yelled at the minder or at the fixer, saying, "You're messing it up. You don't understand any of this." And it was very basic quotes, and Fisk was standing there absolutely clueless. He did not know what was going on. There was some other time when I met him later and we discussed that point, and he actually accused me of climbing on other colleagues when for actually having pointed out that his fixer was not giving him the accurate quotes or doing their job very well. I was worried about his journalism. Actually, I wasn't looking to get a job as Robert Fisk's fixer next time, but and he said something in Arabic that also didn't make any sense. And then there was this issue of him once talking about the Ba'ath Party motto of Ummatun Arabiyyatun Wahida, one Arab nation, where I understood Ummah nation as mother,
Wow. That's incredible. Tell me about, because you're in France now. Tell me about what happened when you accepted your asylum, when your asylum application was accepted, and you moved to France. How did that impact your relationship with the media outlets you were working with?
That was a tricky thing because even though I had been living in Lebanon in very, very dangerous circumstances, worrying about being deported to Syria any day, anytime I left my house, I would have this fear because I had no status. And even though hundreds of thousands of Syrians were like me, I was probably the only one at that point who's also at the same time working for international media outlets and writing or contributing to articles that when the regime in Syria or the government in Lebanon was not happy with. So that added to the fear that I had, because someone can arrest you and deport you and then say, oh, it's actually not because of his journalism, it's just because he lived here illegally and that's our right to do, even though that would also not technically be correct. But so you can imagine that the day when I learned that I got this visa to come to France, I was absolutely very, very happy to finally move somewhere where I can be, for the first time ever, secure and safe and have my rights. But I immediately afterwards realized that it's going to come at a cost. When I left Syria, it was, of course, I did not have any other choice. And it led to me losing a job that I referred to earlier, even though I had it in secret and risked my life doing it. I was let go from that job immediately afterwards because I lost my value. My value was that I was inside Syria and I was no longer there. So there was no reason for them to keep me as far as they thought. And I was worried that this scenario might happen once again, and this time it could be a lot more damaging because moving from Syria to Lebanon is not like leaving the entire region and moving to France. And I know that I can always, at the time, I could always land a job at a company or a media outlet or a research institute that's working on Syria, not because I was so brilliant, but because I spoke the language and I had the local contacts and the context and the experience. I knew that being removed from the region is going to cost me a lot of this value. And at the time, I hadn't reached the point yet where it was my decision to no longer work on Syria. I was actually still very invested in continuing the work that I do, believing that I can work on Syria from France as well as I can from Lebanon. But unfortunately, it ended up also costing me a position at a company that I was working for eventually. And it was around then when I thought, maybe I can't keep doing this time and time again, company and company again. I just needed something stable.
What did they tell you when you moved? Did you say, I wanted to continue writing about Syria, and they said no, and we want someone else?
We had discussions with several colleagues about this, and mostly they were feeling that it doesn't make much sense for a Syria reporter to be based in France, very far away. And at the time, my point was that I report from Lebanon.
You might as well be based anywhere. I mean, most journalists covering Syria
Yes,
are based in Lebanon, and it doesn't really matter. It's the same.
exactly.
It's the same situation, and at least you have the contact.
Exactly. And that's the point I was trying to make. I guess some people in Lebanon maybe every now and then go to Syria, whether to Kurdish held areas or opposition held areas or even regime held areas. Of course, none of these was an option to me. But maybe sometimes people meet people coming in and out of Syria in Beirut because it's such an important stop on the way. But I didn't even have any of this. I was, even when I was in Lebanon, I was not even able to do lots of field work there because I was, again, illegal and unable to go places and talk to people and risk being caught at a checkpoint or asked to show my passport or my residency and fail to show any. So I wasn't doing any field work in Lebanon except, when the October 17, 2019 uprising started there. And it was somewhat easy to move around because security forces were busy doing other things than arresting Syrians and deporting them. So I believe that it would not have any effect on my work for those media outlets. Some of the editors and the colleagues viewed it a different way, and I respect their point. Maybe they have a point. But it led to me, losing. Sometimes it gets, I even heard that you don't want the byline to say Paris, for example, the dateline. You want when it says Beirut, it makes more sense. So it's the proximity that the reader sees when they read Beirut. It makes more sense than reading Paris, and that the reader doesn't really know the background story to this person who's sitting in Paris, thousands of miles away, and talking about Syria. Maybe that's a very valid point. I don't know.
Okay, so let me have this straight. So you started reporting on Syria from inside Syria, one of the most dangerous locales in the world, and most dangerous places to report on as a journalist, where several journalists were killed, arrested, kidnapped, etc., over the course of the uprising turned civil war. You left and moved to Lebanon, where you continued to work for international media organizations, again risking your well-being, risking getting arrested, as an illegal immigrant to Lebanon at that point. And then after these years of risking your well-being, reporting for international media outlets, you had the opportunity to move to France, where you could become a citizen and apply for asylum. And the moment you stepped out of Beirut, you lost your job.
Yeah, technically not the moment I left, but a few months later. It turned to a part-time job when I reached France, and then slowly it was also being extended a lot because of COVID-19, which kind of made the process of finding someone to replace me somewhat harder in the region.
Doesn't make it less awful. Did you broach the idea of covering France for your for the international media outlets that you already had relationships with?
I did, yes, and I still have this idea actually, but I I felt, that when I first arrived here, that I obviously wasn't ready. I was not going. I spent my life sitting and talking about, and just as we did now, talking about people needing to learn the language and know the culture and have contacts and all of that. And even though I came to France already knowing the language, but which of course needed and still needs improving, I did not want to immediately become a France correspondent out of nowhere. So I wanted to take my time to read the daily newspapers and read some books, understand the history, the present, and know more about the country. Before moving here, I wasn't really following France or the news there, apart from what everyone else, reads and hears. And I've only been here almost 2 years, and I feel a lot better now about how I understand and know the country than I did when I first arrived. And I still entertain the idea of writing about the country. I do have one fear because the past few years I was pigeonholed doing only Syria, which is another point that we haven't yet addressed, that I was getting ready to kind of move on from and do other things as a journalist. Unfortunately, I was not viewed as someone who also can do other things that can employ my skills and experience doing different regions or countries or themes. Um, but I was also getting concerned because it seemed like I could easily become pigeonholed once again, doing uh, that I could easily be pigeonholed doing Islamism, terrorism, immigration. Of course, all of these very, very important subjects, like the Syria issue, is an important subject. But people look at me and see Arabic speaker from an Arab country, so maybe that's all they can do. Which I'm very happy to be covering these issues again here in France, but it's important for me to make companies realize that I can also do more, that I can cover what everyone else can cover as well.
I think it's extraordinary that you've got this self consciousness about it, because no foreign correspondent spends 2 years in the Middle East, let alone knows the language as well, and knows, has a detailed understanding of the culture prior to moving there. Whereas, Arab or Arab origin correspondents are, expected to cover that exclusively. It's I don't think a ton of foreign journalists would, balk at the idea of going to cover France, even if they didn't have a ton of prior experience with it, which I think, I mean, for obvious reasons, hampers your knowledge of the nuances of the culture, and makes it harder to do your job, quite frankly. And it's extraordinary that, even after spending 2 years, and already knowing the language, that you're still feeling self-conscious about the idea of reporting on it.
Yeah, I think it has to do with just that, actually. Maybe having witnessed the effect that this could have on the reporting and on the jobs of certain people and on how locals are left feeling when they read this kind of reporting. I realized that, I should not be on the other side of this. I should not be someone who's contributing to this happening in another country. So maybe it has to do precisely with me having been a victim of that before.
I appreciate that. I wanted to talk to you about the second, angle in the reason for why you stopped writing about Syria. So, one of them is, as we've elucidated at length, has to do with, the practices and the ways that, international media handles, covering a big story like Syria and how it handles working with local journalists who are, extraordinarily talented like yourself, but who because of where they come from, don't get the opportunity to rise in the ranks in the same way that you would elsewhere. But the other side of this is your mental health. And I wanted to start by reading a quote from the piece that you wrote, because I think it really elucidates the challenges of kind of being transplanted from home and from your experiences at home with moving to a place like Paris. So you say, to start with, I grew up surrounded by people who have never experienced the joy of peaceful tranquility, the insouciance of summer holiday, or the option of disconnecting for a few hours a day to indulge in a variety of pastimes. I thought that this was normal. I would hear the stories of family members who died fighting in wars or in the dungeons of Syria's secret service. And much like any other Syrian, I grew up trying to avoid the same destiny. I thought that this was also normal. When the war broke out in 2011 and many of us quickly grew accustomed to its horrors, programming my days around the possibility of rockets or mortar shells falling around me became increasingly ordinary, like picking clothes appropriate for the weather. And when I had to escape, it was just another thing that I had to do. I wanted to ask you about this idea of normal, and what it means to be normal, and what the thing that struck you the most about arriving in France and how different it was to your old normal. Could you talk a little bit about what it means to be normal?
Of course, and I hope that I'll be able to answer this because it's something that I'm really still trying to understand myself. I was shocked to realize that what I had been going through all those years wasn't really normal, ridiculous as this may sound. Um, Only very recently when I moved here, because I started, thinking about it when people here that meet me and ask me questions about myself, how I left Syria and why, and how I lived in Lebanon, why I had to leave, and I would answer them, narrating the facts and how it happened and why it had to happen. And then almost every time I would be asked, "How did you feel about it?" And I would find this a bit perplexing because I wouldn't want to say, "Oh, not much," because I didn't want to give out this image that uh, I'm devoid of any feeling. I don't think that I am, and at the time, I really was not thinking about it in that sense, or I didn't really have the room to process any of those feelings. I suppose when I left Syria, I remember being on the plane and just getting out and not really it wasn't sinking. I wasn't being like, oh, I just, lost my country and everything basically. And I absolutely had no idea what's going to happen next. I had no money. I was about to know that I've lost my job and start all over again. And then this happened again. And at the time, I had every right to, and I should maybe have treated this and processed this emotionally, but I didn't. And I thought if I could survive this without feeling depressed or feeling, anything of the sort, I maybe you know, have survived the worst part of mental health, as I say, in the article. Sorry. And I think being hit with what normal means for others, so the normal that does not include rockets and mortar shells and explosions and checkpoints and fearing deportation to a country where I could face torture to death, is a very different kind of normal, of course, and one that I wanted to make mine when I moved here. this was one of the main things that I wanted to focus on. I wanted to live a normal life. I wanted to get a normal employment, beginning in the morning, ending in the afternoon, then going out to have a drink or dinner, go to the theater or to an exhibition, and not have to worry about work outside work hours. And just because I saw French people doing that, and I said, that's exactly what I want. And I thought that this is going to be just me becoming happier immediately. But it actually contributed to me once I started to engage in this, realizing every single bit that went wrong in my life beforehand, how big that was, how impactful it was on me. I had not processed any of that, and it hit me all of a sudden when I was here, when I was living the normal that that actually is a normal life outside of what you normalize when you go through these horrible events when you're living in a country like Syria and Lebanon. And I, of course, consider myself to be very privileged. You know, I never was actually arrested or actually hurt
It's a
in
very
an
low bar to
explosion
set,
or
Esther, for privilege.
but you get the idea. And that's how it all hit me. I think that, you know, it was exactly a year ago, in towards the end of 2020, when I was at the lowest ever. And you would think I would have thought it absolutely ridiculous. I had been probably at you know, my best situation in living in Paris, not having to worry about rent or about money or you know, I had my social security, my health insurance, my bank account, my job, my salary, my residency. Most importantly, no one's going to deport me anywhere, and a path forward also towards citizenship, towards pursuing my interests and all of that. And you would think that this is absolutely the worst, or the, you know, the most wrong moment for me to collapse and have this meltdown. And yet it turned out to be the ideal point for it to hit, when you start to compare, not even consciously, the situation that you're living in now with what you've gone through before.
You know, foreigners never really realize how important ID documents are to us, huh? It's one of
Yeah,
those things.
absolutely.
My passport is my most cherished possession in this world. When did you? Was there a moment when you realized that you know, the true scale of what you'd left behind and what you lost, and like it truly hit you?
I think it should be around that same time, you know, a year ago, when, because when I first arrived to France, actually before that, because when I was in Syria and when I was in Lebanon, uh, as I say in that excerpt that you just shared, it wasn't just me, it was also everyone around me. I would look around me and see people struggling and striving to survive month by month, whether financially or physically or health wise, or, you know, in many different ways. Everyone's working day and night, everyone's working weekends, no one's taking holiday. And that also contributed to me feeling that it was normal. So it wasn't just because things were happening to me, but they were also happening to everyone else around me. And here it was quite different. And I started to see that and live in that condition. But in the beginning, the first few months, you know, they were crazy. I just arrived here. There were people that I wanted to meet. The pandemic was just hitting. And I also need to stress that the pandemic plays a big part in all of this, because all this dramatic scene that I just described of me realizing how or it hitting me that everything I'd gone through before coming here wasn't normal happened during a very bad and very long strict lockdown in winter around the holidays near my birthday, that, you know, a time that I spent alone for the first time in my life in a small Parisian apartment. It was dark and it was cold and it was lockdown. I couldn't leave more than one kilometer outside of my apartment, and that contributed largely to it. During the first lockdown and when I first arrived, I guess I was very busy settling in, starting the paperwork, finding a place to stay, and figuring out what's going to happen next in terms of professionally and career. And you know, the first lockdown, I guess for many people, wasn't as hard as the second lockdown. We were still trying to understand what's going on, what's this new disease, following the numbers, watching the free ballets and theater plays that are being streamed online for people to enjoy the lockdown. And the second one was the more depressing one for many people, and it was also the setting for what was to happen with me in terms of my career and my background.
And how did you cope from having the full extent of what had happened kind of hit you? How did you manage to cope with it? You talked in the essay about taking long walks. I think you've also essentially read the entirety of the Western canon over the period of the lockdown. Um, how did you deal with it, especially as you were in a lockdown and so far away from family and loved ones?
As you said, those were the main two things that I did. I walked and walked and walked a lot. It was during lockdown that I also discovered the joys of audiobooks. So what really helped me go through all of these is that I would be at home sitting by my window and reading, and then get out when I can and go on a very long walk by the Seine and listen to another book while I'm doing that. And they were all carefully chosen to be very, very far removed geographically and thematically from where I come from and what I worked on. So I would read about the Renaissance, I would read about antiquity, I would read fiction and poetry, of course, and all of that really, really had a major effect on me. It really consoled me, and even specific authors, I could really feel how I'm being consoled by reading them and going through their works. There were phone calls with friends, and there were the walks. They had a very, very good effect on me. Of course, Paris is a very beautiful city to walk around. And then there was the period when I started to take action, and I started doing that immediately. I took a very big risk and made a very important decision, which is, of course, the title and the reason of this article, that I will slowly phase out every single thing that I was working on that had to do with Syria and do something else. Not to work on Syria anymore, and not to do, not to take a news assistant job anymore, and just focus on something that is that I can do without all of this emotional and professional toll on me. And I began that very, December, January of 2020 and 2021, respectively, taking that action, sending emails around saying, after this project, I'm sorry, but I have to wrap up my collaboration with you. Some of those collaborations actually were what you would call easy. I was getting money out of them. And at this point, I was one of the people who can do Syria work efficiently and sometimes even easily, because I had developed over the years a network of sources on all sides, and I can get quotes, I can get verify information rather quickly. I would even translate and do a lot of that, and I decided. And then here I realized once again that I was making a big sacrifice, because losing a lot of my value by leaving Syria and then leaving Lebanon. Now I'm also leaving them thematically. So that was a crazy decision in a certain way, because whatever value I was left with at this point, I was throwing out of the window this time, by my decision and my intention. A year later, almost, of course, I can tell you that it was the best decision, one of the best decisions I've ever made. And that action that I took really contributed to how much better I started to feel almost immediately after the last thing that I did on Syria was over. I wrote, I think, for New Lines also about Syria, and things were happening there. I was doing some research and contributing to some articles. And then I was on a podcast, and when all of that was over, even though those projects themselves, weren't actively contributing to making my life worse, it was just a theme. Afterwards, I was feeling very, very relieved, and I continue to feel the same way now.
What are you working on? What have you been working on since you stopped writing about Syria?
Well, what helped me take this action, which of course I need to say, because it's not like I made it, it would be misleading to say that I actually made all these decisions and pursued, doing something else without any plan or without any backup plan to protect me, in a sense. I was lucky that during that very dark period, I was offered a job that wasn't journalism, a job at a non-governmental organization doing communications, and it's for a good cause. It's a very good job, and I really like it. And it's limited hours every day, 9 to 5, and you can do your job well, and then you can go enjoy your evening or your weekend or your holiday. I'm about to have my Christmas holiday. It's going to be a long one this year. I'm very excited about it. And I stopped doing a lot of the freelance side projects that I were doing on the side before, but I didn't stop writing, at least in theory, because I now have moved on, at least since then, from writing news and contributing to other people's news articles to writing what I want to write. And thanks to New Lines and Receive 22 and other publications, it has been a possibility for me to start exploring other things that I can write. And sometimes they have to do with Syria, but not with what's going on in Syria now, not news, but something maybe that has to do with the country's history or background or culture. And I absolutely enjoy doing this. And I think now that I don't write for a living at this point, I think it's even having a good effect on and a good impact on my writing in general. Even though I've been a bit slow, but I think I've been recuperating. And now I think you of all people know this very well. You're waiting to hear back from me on some of the ideas that I was pushing for New Lines to take, and then I would disappear and be very slow. But I think that I'm also getting to a phase where I can write these things and actually enjoy writing them.
I appreciate that, and I find myself in the same way, and it's usually I chalk it up to burnout. In your case, it's obviously a lot more than that. It's a huge accumulation of many things. Do you see yourself ever going back to writing about current affairs in Syria, or doing full-time journalism again, or is that in your past now?
You really want me to do that next article, don't you?
Always. Look, when I say you're an extremely talented writer, it's not one of those Egyptian compliments that we don't really mean. As we call it bekash. It's not really. It's a true thing. You are one of the most talented writers, one of the most talented journalists and reporters I've ever seen perform the craft,
Thank you.
quite frankly, and that's why I think it's you deserve a spot at the very top echelons of the world of journalism in our part of the world.
It means a lot to me. Thank you so much. I'm not going to, just say, no, I'm never, ever again writing a word about Syria. I was having dinner with a friend a few weeks ago, and he was saying it would be quite funny if you get a Syria job or write something about Syria after you write all this and you say all this on New Lines. But
It would be an interesting 180-degree turn there.
but I know, yes, I don't think this is going to happen anytime soon. I do think that I still need a lot of time to recuperate from that subject in particular, and from what came to it as a package. But I obviously, no, I don't rule out ever going back to doing this. And as I just said, I'm still very interested in things that have to do with Syria, but maybe more of what relating to the historical context, people who lived in the past century, for example, or things that happened. The thing that I was really, fed up with is covering what's been happening in the past decades. Of course, very unfortunate, very important to keep being reported, and I almost feel guilty because I think that's a role for me to play, because I can play it. But I think that I have done, what I could during those past few years, and I do need a break. And I don't think it'd be, helpful for anyone if I don't take that break.
I think you've 100% earned that break. Before you go, and sorry to put you on the spot, I have one last question for you. In your readings and in the books that you found solace and succor in over the past few months, the past year, are there any particular passages or books quotes or ideas from those books that you found particularly soothing that you'd like to share?
Absolutely. What a wonderful question. Because you've put me on the spot, I may choose something that may not turn out to be, if I think about it, I may change my opinion. Obviously, there are very strong candidates here. I think that of course, 2022 and 2020 were the years that I read most in my life. I'm very happy about this. One particular philosopher, actually, that I read a lot this year and last year was Seneca, of course, the Roman first century philosopher, Stoic philosopher who was Nero's teacher, which is, of course, not a great job to have, knowing the emperor's history. But he was a Stoic man who wrote about work, he wrote about labor, and he wrote about the important things in life, about reading and about appreciating what one has, and knowing also that a lot of things, are meaningless and not really worth all the trouble that we do, including the labor that we do on earth. And I think reading Seneca's works and letters really were really influential and really helped me. In addition, there are two of my all-time favorite writers, Oscar Wilde and Dostoevsky. I read a lot of their works and reread some of their works in 2020 during the first lockdown and the second lockdown, and just going back to those familiar texts and novels and articles that describe how the human condition develops and works is something that I always find very, very helpful. And they continue to be very good friends and to provide great entertainment as well as education in many, many fields.
Appreciate that. And on that note, Asser Khattab, thank you for being here with us. Thank you for your work, and I hope you take care of yourself.
Thank you. Thanks, Kareem. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Asser's essay, Why I Stopped Writing About Syria, is on our website. You can subscribe to the New Lines Magazine podcast on your favorite podcast app. And of course, you can find more stories on Syria and from across the Middle East and beyond on our website, newlinesmag.com. Thank you all for joining us.